Kara Shalom, welcome to our watercolor journey. What can watercolor do for you? In this demonstration, Heinrich will show some interesting traits of watercolor, so stick around. The materials used are listed in the description below. You will also need a spray bottle and some salt and a store card for this one. On the palette we have Prussian Blue and Venetian Red. The Canson paper is taped to a board and the board is at an angle of 45 degrees. Heinrich wants the paint to flow down towards the horizon line, and the angle of the board will help the paint to spread. He uses the silver number 14 mop to wet the top half of the paper thoroughly. Remember that watercolors fade drastically when they dry, so if you have a very wet background and you want the colors to stand out a bit, you will need to use stronger pigment. He starts off with a premix of Prussian Blue and Venetian Red to create a dark grey, almost black color. You can also use burnt sienna with French ultramarine or transparent orange with French ultramarine. Colors with an orange hue like these mix very well with the stronger blues to make lovely greys, blacks and dark browns. The pigment is fairly strong because he wants a darker area at the top, and as the paint flows down into the picture plane, it will dilute to become much lighter. He adds a bit of the pure Prussian Blue and then he sprays the paper with a spray bottle. The spray will help the paint to flow some more and can create interesting effects in the paint. Here it initially created tiny spots, but as the paint flows down, it looks like rain falling. He picks up some more of the black mix and starts to draw the horizon line. The bottom part of the picture plane is dry, so the strong pigment stays where he paints it. Notice where the pigment touches the water on the left, it feathers out a bit, but it doesn't run. The consistency of the pigment is stronger than the water on the paper. That is why it doesn't spread so much. He draws diagonal lines to create a varied terrain, and he uses the belly of the brush to create these broken lines. This is called dry brushing. The pigment on the brush is fairly strong or fairly dry, and you lightly sweep the brush over the surface of the paper. In this way, the paint only lies on top of the raised areas of the paper and leaves plenty of white space to work with. For this technique, rough paper works very well. The effect won't be as visible on cold pressed paper. He does not clean the brush. He allows the color on the brush to mix with colors that he picks up from the palette. This creates interesting color variations on the paper. Notice again that the pigment here is fairly strong. Look at the difference between the pigment placed in the foreground where the paper is dry and the same pigment placed on the horizon line where the paper is still very wet. He uses the existing pigment and flicks the brush up to push some of the stronger pigment into the water. This is not a technique that he uses often, but it makes for an interesting tree line. The water helps to create soft edges around the trees and gives them a more natural outline. The brush has picked up some of the water from the sky area, and when he dips it into the paint mix now, it dilutes the paint. It is important to watch your water content, not only on the palette, but also on your brush. You can see that the paint now looks a bit different, more watery than before. He wanted to see what would happen to the stronger pigment if he sprays it again. The bottom half of the paper was dry. Now, as he sprays it, the paint starts to flow into the natural crevices of the paper. If you spray more water, it would start to lie on top of the paper and then let the paint flow uniformly. If you want to make use of the texture of the paper, keep the spraying light. He tilts the board to help the paint flow. Notice that even though he sprayed the paper, there are still some dry patches. Even if he tilts the board, the paint does not flow into those dry patches. This is useful when you want to create the illusion of snow or just have more light in your painting. In a landscape like this, it is useful to preserve as much of the white as possible. You can always paint over the white, but it's very difficult to bring back the natural white, especially if you work with staining pigments. The paint in the top half of the paper has settled a bit. He mixes another batch of the Prussian and Venetian, and he starts to dab in the tree line. This is a strong mix, meaning there is less water and more pigment. He doesn't want the colors to fade too much. That is why he uses a stronger mix here. He uses the tip of the silver black velvet number 8 round to add the trees. Because the pigment is strong, it also doesn't spread so much into the sky. Here is where warm and cool colors also play a significant role. Prussian blue is a cool color, so it makes the objects recede. Venetian red is a warm color, so by placing the warm color on top of the cool color, it makes those areas come forward. That helps to create depth and distance in your painting. He uses the corner of a store card to etch in some grass. The pigment is still very wet, so the card creates tiny furrows where the paint pools. This creates dark lines, which are permanent. Have a look at where the pigment is the strongest and start from there. Pull out the lines to form grass stalks. Look at the lay of the terrain and then think about where the grasses or small bushes will help to form the terrain and where they will enhance your painting. Don't just pull them out at random. They should help to create harmony and texture. To create some more texture, he adds a few granules of salt. Salt is very unpredictable. He uses ordinary table salt, but you can use any kind you like. If you rub the salt between your fingers, it will give a different texture from larger granules. So again, decide what kind of texture you want and act accordingly. If the paper is too wet, the salt will simply dissolve with no visible effect. If it's too dry, the salt will just lay on top and do nothing. Salt tends to make a hard crust where the paper is too wet. It is very difficult to remove the salt then. Timing your salt addition is crucial, and we recommend that you practice this a bit. Let the painting dry. Notice the effects of the salt and how the colors faded once the paper has dried. Also take a look at the soft and hard edges in the painting, how these help to create interest and depth. The salt has created beautiful blooms, which you now can use to create some bushes. Heinrich uses a Chinese calligraphy brush and some of the premixed pigment to paint in some grass stalks and bushes. He uses the texture created by the salt to guide him. Add some darker lines next to the lighter areas to create dimension. The lines created by the card have faded somewhat, so the dark painted lines now give some depth to the foreground. Lighter objects will recede and darker objects will come to the front. If you don't have a rigger, you can definitely invest in a much cheaper Chinese calligraphy brush. These thin brushes give beautiful fine lines and are easy to use. He draws some trunks and branches in the background for the trees. These are at a distance, so there isn't much detail. Usually, you would ground all your objects to ensure that they don't look like they're floating in the air. However, in this case, the softness of the bushes in the background looks like it disguises the base of the trees, so it is perfectly fine to leave them that way. Use the existing textures to guide you when you draw the trees. One of the main points we would like to make today is do not fiddle. It is so easy to overwork your painting. Stand back from it and have a look at what you have done. Assess whether it really needs anything else. If you feel that you should maybe add something, stop. Come back the next day and look at it again. You will find that many times you can improve on it by looking at it with fresh eyes. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and let us know in the comments if you found these tips and techniques useful. You are welcome to share your paintings with us on Instagram. Thank you for watching. We hope to see you soon. Vaya con Dios.